The restaurant was one of those places Vanessa loved. All exposed brick, low lighting, loud music that forced everyone to lean in and shout. The kind of fashionable Chicago bistro that felt designed to make you feel slightly out of place unless you belonged there. We slid into a long table with her friends, already halfway through cocktails, coats draped over chairs, laughter bouncing off the walls. I stayed quiet, like I usually did in those settings, nodding along, sipping my drink, letting the conversation roll past me about work drama, vacations, people I barely knew. Vanessa was animated, magnetic, completely at home, telling stories with her hands, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. I watched her the way I often did lately, like I was observing something from a distance rather than participating in it. At some point, the conversation shifted to relationships, to living arrangements, to how hard it was to find time for intimacy when everyone was so busy. Someone teased Vanessa about being married already, about being locked down so young. She laughed easily, didn't miss a beat, and then said it, smiling wide, lifting her glass like she was delivering a punchline she knew would land. Honestly, half the time it feels like I just live with my roommate. She tilted her head toward me when she said it, casual, effortless. The table exploded in laughter, sharp and immediate, like they had all been primed for it. Someone slapped the table. Another nearly choked on their drink. I smiled automatically, a reflex I perfected, but inside something went cold and still. It wasn't the words themselves, not really. It was the way she said them, the confidence, the lack of hesitation, like this wasn't a joke she'd just come up with, but something rehearsed, something familiar. What hit me hardest was that no one looked surprised. No awkward glances, no confusion, no one checking my face to see if I was okay. It was received as truth dressed up as humor. Vanessa kept talking, adding little details, joking about schedules and separate routines, and each laugh felt like it was pressing me deeper into my chair. I noticed how she didn't look at me again, not once, like my reaction didn't matter, or maybe wasn't worth acknowledging. I could hear my own heartbeat under the noise of the room, felt heat creeping up my neck while my hands stayed oddly steady. I thought about how often I'd downplayed things, how often I'd told myself I was being sensitive, that this was just her sense of humor. Sitting there, surrounded by strangers who suddenly felt like witnesses, it dawned on me that this version of our marriage wasn't new to them. It had been introduced, refined, and repeated long before this dinner. I finished my drink without tasting it, the laughter still ringing in my ears, and realized that whatever I thought we were presenting to the world, it clearly wasn't the same story Vanessa had been telling. The waiter arrived at the wrong moment, smiling, oblivious, asking if we want another round, and Vanessa ordered for both of us without looking my way, already moving on, already done. I caught my reflection in the dark window beside our table and barely recognized the man staring back, shoulders slightly hunched, expression carefully neutral, someone trying very hard not to be a problem. The noise around me felt distant, like I was underwater, every laugh muffled but heavy. I replayed the joke in my head, the timing, the way it slid so easily into the conversation, and I understood that it wasn't meant to hurt me directly. It was meant to bond her with them, to place me somewhere beneath the story she was telling about her life. I sat there for the rest of the dinner, answering when spoken to, smiling when expected, all while a quiet certainty settled in my chest, slow and uncomfortable, that I had just learned something important about how she saw me, and how long she'd been seeing me that way. I stayed silent until the plates cleared. The ride home was quiet in that specific way that only feels loud when something important has been left unsaid. The city lights streaking past the windows as Vanessa drove with one hand on the wheel and the other scrolling her phone, humming softly along to a song playing low on the radio like the night had gone exactly as planned. She looked relaxed, satisfied, occasionally smiling at something on her screen, and that contrast made my chest feel tight. I waited until we were a few blocks away from the restaurant before I spoke, keeping my voice calm and even, not accusatory, just stating what had been sitting heavy inside me since the table laughed. I told her I didn't understand why she thought it was funny to talk about me like that in front of her friends, to reduce me to a joke, to call me her roommate, as if that was all I was. She let out a sharp breath and rolled her eyes so hard I could see it even without turning my head, like I'd just complained about something trivial and inconvenient. She said I was being sensitive, that I always took things too personally, that it was obviously a joke and everyone knew it. She didn't look at me when she said it, her attention still fixed on her phone, thumb moving endlessly as if my words were background noise she didn't need to fully register. She told me it was harmless, that I needed to relax, that I was ruining her mood by dragging this out instead of just letting it go. There was no pause where she considered how it landed, no moment of reflection, No attempt to meet me halfway or acknowledge that maybe it had crossed a line. The irritation in her voice was clear, not at herself, but at me like I was the problem for bringing it up at all. I tried once more to explain that it hadn't felt harmless from my seat, that it felt humiliating, that it hurt, but she cut me off with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes and said I was overthinking it, that her friends loved me, that I should be grateful she could joke about our relationship so openly. The word grateful stuck with me, heavy and sour. She turned the volume up slightly on the radio, a subtle but deliberate signal that the conversation was over, and the rest of the drive passed with her humming again, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel in time with the music. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets blur together, feeling something inside me go quiet in a way it never had before. It wasn't anger or sadness exactly. It was more like a switch flipping off, a realization settling in that my feelings were an inconvenience to her, something to be dismissed rather than taken seriously. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I already knew that whatever I'd hoped for from that conversation, an apology, understanding, even basic respect, wasn't coming, and the absence of it felt louder than any argument ever could. She parked the car, grabbed her purse, and walked inside ahead of me without another word, leaving me sitting there for a moment longer, hands resting in my lap. Realizing that the silence between us wasn't temporary, but something much deeper, I stayed there breathing slowly until I followed. The house lights came on automatically as the door opened, familiar and impersonal, and she moved through the space like I wasn't even there, already slipping back in her night. And with each step she took away from me, the numb certainty grew stronger and clearer inside my chest. Steady and irreversible, I understood then that this wasn't about one joke or one dinner, but about how easily my discomfort could be dismissed. And that understanding settled over me with a calm that felt colder than anger ever had I closed the car door quietly behind me and followed her inside, already feeling the emotional distance stretch wider, solidifying into something that could no longer be ignored or explain away. That realization stayed with me. As I stepped into the house, it felt final and unchangeable. I said nothing. The next morning I woke up before my alarm like I always did, the house quiet and dim, and for the first time in years I didn't roll out of bed with that automatic sense of responsibility humming in my chest. I didn't head straight for the kitchen to start the coffee the way Vanessa liked it, didn't check the weather to remind her to bring a jacket, didn't glance at my phone to see if she'd texted from the other room, asking where her keys were. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if every small action now required intention instead of habit. When she came into the kitchen, hair still messy, half awake, she paused for a second, clearly waiting for the mug to already be on the counter, for me to be mid-sentence about plans for the day, and when none of that happened, she just shrugged and poured herself cereal without comment. I was polite, neutral, distant in a way that felt strange, but also oddly peaceful. I answered her questions with short, calm responses, offered nothing extra, didn't ask how she slept, didn't follow up on her schedule or her mood. I went about my day as if I was living alongside her instead of around her, and that pattern didn't change the next day or the one after that. I stopped engaging in the small emotional check-ins that used to fill the space between us, stopped anticipating her needs, stopped smoothing over awkward moments or doing favors without being asked. There were no dramatic conversations, no cold shoulders, no visible anger, just a quiet withdrawal that even surprised me with how natural it felt once I committed to it. Vanessa seemed to assume at first that I was sulking, that this was another phase where I needed time to cool off and would eventually snap back into place like I always had before. She made a few light comments about me being moody, rolled her eyes when I didn't react, and carried on with her routines as if nothing had fundamentally changed. But days passed, and the absence of my usual presence started to fill the house in a way arguments never had. Without my reactions, her jokes fell flat. Without my attention, her stories lingered unfinished. I noticed her glancing at me more often, lingering in doorways, testing the air with small remarks clearly meant to provoke some response, any response. I stayed calm, courteous, and detached, and that seemed to unsettle her more than raised voices ever could. The house felt different, quieter but heavier, like something essential had been removed, and no one knew how to name it. I could see the confusion creeping in as she realized I wasn't waiting for an apology or a resolution, wasn't building toward confrontation, wasn't keeping score. I was simply absent while still being there. And with each passing day, that distance solidified into something real and undeniable. What surprised me most was how steady I felt, how choosing silence over arguments didn't feel like giving up, but like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Dinner at my parents' house was supposed to be uneventful, the kind of quiet evening that happens in a small Indiana suburb where nothing ever really changes. The house smelled like roast chicken and familiar spices. The table set neatly the way my mom always did, and for a moment it almost felt like stepping back into a simpler version of my life. Vanessa played the role she always did, smiling easily, complimenting the food, laughing at my dad's dry jokes, settling into the rhythm of the evening as if the tension between us didn't exist. I stayed polite and calm, answering when spoken to, helping clear plates, keeping my tone even. Halfway through dinner, as the conversation drifted toward work and married life, Vanessa leaned back in her chair and smiled in that familiar way I'd learned to recognize, the one that came right before she turned something personal into entertainment. She laughed lightly and said that living with me lately felt more like sharing a house with a roommate than being married, delivering the line with the same casual confidence she'd used before, clearly expecting the same easy laughter. Instead, the room went quiet in a way that felt immediate and heavy. My dad stopped mid-bite, my mom's hand froze on her fork, and the hum of the overhead light suddenly felt too loud. I didn't rush to fill the silence or deflect it the way I usually would. I nodded once and calmly agreed with her, my voice steady as I said that she was right, that I had stopped trying because every time I did, I was treated like an inconvenience instead of a partner. I explained without raising my voice that after a while, constantly being dismissed made it pointless to keep putting in effort, and that living like roommates was the result, not the cause. The words hung in the air, clear and unavoidable. My parents listened closely, their expressions shifting from confusion to something closer, to understanding, as they finally saw the pattern laid out plainly in front of them. Vanessa laughed it off at first, a sharp, forced sound, waving her hand as if it was all still part of a joke that had simply landed wrong. But I saw it then, the way her confidence faltered, the way her smile tightened and her eyes flicked from my face to my parents and back again, searching for the reaction she'd expected and not finding it. My mom asked a gentle but serious question about how long things had been like this, and I answered honestly, without embellishment or blame, just facts delivered calmly. The rest of the dinner continued, but the energy had changed, the easy flow replaced by something more deliberate and careful. Vanessa grew quieter, her laughter coming a beat too late, her posture stiff, and for the first time I realized she understood that this time, the joke hadn't protected her, and the absence I'd chosen had followed us into a room where she no longer controlled the narrative. I could feel my parents' concerns settle over the table like a weight, not dramatic or explosive, but undeniable, and while no one raised their voice or pushed further, the truth had already been spoken out loud in a place where it could not be dismissed as oversensitivity or moodiness. Vanessa kept smiling, kept nodding, but the ease she usually carried herself with was gone, replaced by a brutal composure that cracked a little more with every passing minute of silence. I ate the rest of my meal slowly, aware of how different this felt from arguing in private, and how much harder it was for her to laugh her way out when other people were finally paying attention. When we eventually stood to leave, the unspoken understanding in the room followed us out the door, quiet, heavy, and impossible to undo. That silence said more than any argument ever had. It stayed with us the entire drive home. Neither of us spoke. The shift was undeniable. Something fundamental had changed between us, and she knew it. There was no pretending anymore. Not here. Ever again, no more. When we got back to the house, the silence from the drive still clung to us, thick and unresolved, and Vanessa broke it almost immediately with a sharp laugh that carried more irritation than humor. She tossed her keys onto the counter and made a comment about how awkward dinner had been, how my parents were so dramatic, and then turned it on me, mocking my tone from earlier, accusing me of putting on some performance just to embarrass her. She said I was being dramatic, that I loved playing the wounded husband whenever I didn't get my way, and that this whole thing would blow over like it always did if I would just stop sulking. I didn't argue with her, didn't correct her version of events, didn't even react the way she clearly expected me to. I walked past her, went down the hallway, and pulled my suitcase out of the closet with a calm that surprised even me. The sound of the zipper breaking the quiet made her pause mid-sentence, and she followed me into the bedroom, still scoffing, still assuming this was part of some temporary display. I started packing methodically, folding clothes, choosing only what I needed, moving with purpose instead of emotion, and that was when the sarcasm in her voice began to thin. She asked what I was doing in a tone that was half amused and half annoyed, like she was indulging a tantrum she expected to end soon. I didn't answer. I kept packing, moving from the dresser to the closet, placing items carefully, deliberately, like I had already made this decision long before this moment. Her laughter stopped completely then, replaced by sharper words, accusations that I was trying to scare her, that I was overreacting, that I was proving her point. I said nothing. The shift in her energy was sudden and unmistakable, the confidence draining from her posture as the reality of what was happening finally reached her. Her voice rose, then cracked, the sarcasm giving way to urgency as she demanded to know where I thought I was going and what I thought I was doing. She stepped closer, blocking the doorway, her tone no longer mocking but frantic, telling me we needed to talk this out, that I couldn't just leave, that I was being ridiculous. I zipped the suitcase closed and stood up, meeting her eyes briefly without anger or softness, just finality. She kept talking, words tumbling over each other now, trying to pull me back into the familiar pattern of arguing, explaining, justifying, anything that would keep me engaged. I didn't give her answers because there was nothing left to explain that hadn't already been ignored. I picked up the suitcase, walked past her as she moved aside too late, and headed for the door. Behind me, her voice followed, sharp with panic, calling my name, demanding I stop, demanding something from me. I opened the door, stepped outside into the cool night air, and closed it quietly behind me, ending the conversation without another word. The house light stayed on behind the door, casting a dull glow through the windows, and I stood there for a brief moment on the porch, listening to the muffled sounds of her pacing inside, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only a steady certainty that arguing had never changed anything and silence finally had. I walked to the car without looking back, set the suitcase in the trunk, and drove away slowly, aware that this was the first decision I had made in a long time that didn't require her approval or understanding. The street was quiet, empty, and ordinary, which somehow made the moment feel more real and irreversible than any shouted argument ever could. I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore, and that absence of words felt like the clearest statement I'd ever made. The door stayed closed behind me. I did not slow down. I did not turn around. I did not argue. I left. That was the choice, and I made it quietly, without asking permission, without explaining, without regret. It was over for me, completely, finally, no arguments. The days that followed passed without any response from me, and the silence wasn't accidental or dramatic. It was simply the absence of something I had finally stopped offering. My phone stayed face down most of the time, and when I did pick it up, I saw her messages stacked neatly in a row, short and controlled, stripped of emotion the way business emails are. She didn't ask how I was or where I was staying. She didn't acknowledge why I'd left or what had led to it. Instead, she treated my absence like a logistical inconvenience, asking when I was coming back to get the rest of my things, reminding me about bills, pointing out things around the house that needed to be done as if I were still responsible for them by default. The tone was distant and oddly familiar, the same way she used to speak to me when she needed something handled but didn't feel the need to soften it with care. I left every message unread, not out of spite, but because engaging would have pulled me back into a dynamic I had already stepped away from. Each day that passed made the silence heavier, more solid, like something setting in place rather than something waiting to be broken. I imagined the house the way I knew it so well, the quiet stretching longer in the mornings without coffee already made, the evenings colder without dinner plans quietly forming in the background, the small routines I'd managed without thinking now sitting undone. I knew she was alone with all of it now, the errands, the scheduling, the little details that used to disappear because I took care of them before they became noticeable. The silence wasn't loud, it didn't announce itself, it just lingered, pressing into the space she was used to filling with motion and noise. I didn't feel satisfaction in that, but I felt certainty. The messages kept coming, a few words at a time, clipped and practical, like she was still expecting me to slot back into place once the shock wore off. I stayed still. With each unread notification, I felt the distance widen, not emotionally but structurally, like a bridge being dismantled piece by piece. I thought about how often I'd filled the quiet before, how I'd rushed to smooth things over, to explain, to reassure, to restore balance at my own expense, and how different it felt now to let the silence stand on its own. Somewhere in that quiet, consequences were taking shape, not as punishment, but as reality settling in the house wasn't angry or dramatic without me. It was just empty in ways she hadn't had to notice before, and colder without the constant maintenance I provided. Days turned into a stretch of time that no apology or casual message could undo, and the longer I stayed silent, the clearer it became that this wasn't about winning or teaching a lesson, it was about absence finally being allowed to mean something. Nearly 2 weeks passed before her voicemails changed, and the shift was obvious enough that I noticed it even without listening to them all the way through at first. The early messages had been clipped and irritated, her voice tight with controlled frustration, telling me I was being unreasonable, that I needed to respond, that this couldn't go on forever. Then, slowly, the sharpness drained out of her tone and was replaced by something thinner and more fragile. The pauses grew longer, her words less certain, the confidence she usually carried no longer holding together. By the time she showed up at my new apartment, the desperation I'd heard creeping into her messages had fully surfaced. I opened the door to find her standing there looking smaller than I remembered, hair pulled back carelessly, eyes tired and red, clothes wrinkled like she hadn't slept properly in days. She looked shaken in a way that wasn't performative, like someone who had finally run out of scripts and wasn't sure what to say next. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the unfamiliar space, taking in the fact that this was real, that I had built a life without her presence in it. She started talking almost immediately, words tumbling out too fast, saying she didn't recognize herself lately, that everything felt off, that the house was too quiet, that she hadn't realized how much I did until I was gone. She asked if there was a chance to fix things, her voice catching on the last word like it physically hurt to say it out loud. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting the silence stretch until she finally looked at me expectantly. When I asked why she wanted to fix it, my voice stayed calm and even, and the question landed heavier than I'd expected. She froze for a moment, blinking like she hadn't prepared for that part, and then she answered in fragments that all circled back to herself. She talked about how lost she felt, how uncomfortable it was managing everything alone, how embarrassed she was that people knew we were separated, how scared she was of starting over. She said she hated how empty the house felt, how stressful her days had become, how much she missed the stability we used to have. She spoke for several minutes without realizing that she hadn't mentioned me once, not my feelings, not the way she treated me, not the words she'd used or the pattern she'd dismissed. There was no ownership in what she said, no acknowledgement of harm, only the weight of her own discomfort pressing forward. I watched her realize it mid-sentence. The way her voice trailed off when she saw my expression hadn't changed, the way her shoulders slumped slightly as the truth settled in. She tried again, softer this time, but the focus didn't shift. It only grew quieter, still centered on how much she was struggling now that the dynamic had changed. Standing there, I understood that what she wanted wasn't accountability or repair, it was relief, a return to something that made her life easier. I didn't argue with her or raise my voice, didn't list grievances or explain myself again, because the conversation had already revealed everything it needed as she stood in my apartment, asking for another chance without being able to articulate what she was actually apologizing for, and that absence said more than any excuse ever could when she finally stopped talking. The space between us felt wide and settled, and I knew that whatever desperation had brought her to my door, it hadn't brought understanding with it when I told her no. There was no anger in my voice, and no satisfaction in finally saying it. Only certainty, steady and unmovable, like something that had finished settling inside me long before she arrived at my door. I told her I wasn't willing to fix something that had never been acknowledged as broken, that I wasn't interested in returning to a version of myself that had learned to accept dismissal as normal. She stared at me like she was waiting for a different ending, for frustration or negotiation or some crack she could slip through, but it never came. I didn't raise my voice, didn't justify my decision, didn't soften it with false hope. I told her this was the end, not as punishment and not as a threat, but as a boundary that had finally been drawn and would not be crossed again. The moment stretched between us, heavy and quiet, and I could see her trying to understand that this time, silence wasn't a tactic, it was final. When she realized there was nothing more to say, nothing left to argue against, something in her expression collapsed inward, not dramatically, but slowly, like air leaking out of something that had relied on pressure to hold its shape. I opened the door for her and stepped back, giving her space to leave without confrontation, without ceremony. She hesitated, looking at me one last time, as if searching for the man who used to bend, who used to explain himself into exhaustion, but that version of me was already gone. I closed the door gently after she stepped out, not slamming it, not lingering, just ending it. And in that quiet click I felt a clean separation from both the marriage and the self I'd been inside it. A month later, my life looked ordinary from the outside, but it felt entirely different from the inside. The days moved at an even pace, unburdened by tension I had once mistaken for normalcy. I woke up without bracing myself, moved through my routines without anticipating someone else's reactions, and went to sleep without replaying conversations or planning emotional repairs for the next day. There was a lightness in the absence of constant self-correction, a calm that came from not having to prove my worth or explain my boundaries. I didn't miss the arguments, and I didn't miss the silence that used to follow them, because this quiet was different, open instead of oppressive, restful instead of punishing. I knew Vanessa was still in the house we'd shared, still surrounded by the routines I'd once carried, and I imagined the stillness there had changed shape now that there was no one left to absorb it. For her, the silence she used to laugh through had stopped being amusing, and without someone to soften its edges, it had become something she had to sit with alone. I didn't take comfort in that, but I didn't shield myself from it either. What mattered was that I was no longer living inside a version of myself that tolerated being minimized, and that freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, breathable, and real. For the first time in a long while, my life felt like my own, and that finality carried no grief, only relief and space to move forward without looking back.